Welcome back to another edition of State of Recruiting with John Garcia Jr. Today, we are going to talk about the race for number one, that being the number one recruiting class in the 2023 recruiting cycle. Joined by, as I said, John Garcia Jr. of SI All American. I'm Brian Driscoll from Irish Breakdown. John, this is going to be, in a lot of years, it's the same names over and over and over again. Every now and then a team like Texas A&M sneaks in last year, but this is an interesting cycle, John, because you have some of the teams in the top five that we're normally used to hearing in the top five: Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia's creeping around, LSU's lurking around. But this year, you look at the top 10, John, there's some new teams that don't often make that race for number one that we're going to talk about. So we're going to see some new faces, maybe some programs on the rise in this battle for number one. But I have a feeling this is going to be one of the more entertaining and debated, and let's see how they finish, races for number one that we've seen in quite some time.
And that's the beauty of it. Usually by this time, we're already saying, well, look, it's probably this team. Maybe this is one contender to challenge Team X. Team X usually being Alabama. Maybe Georgia's the contender, and it's kind of chalk for a given recruiting cycle. But yeah, Brian, this year it feels wide open. You've got, of course, Alabama sitting there. Notre Dame has sat there the longest of any program in this class of 2023. Texas is here, following that Arch Manning hype, buzz, momentum after that verbal commitment on June 23rd. Texas has creeped up and higher on the list. So it's really fascinating to look at. And of course, Ohio State is still there as well. So I think it's fitting that you've got, of these top four contenders for number one, you've got two from the old guard in Alabama and Ohio State. And then you've got two from, either a first or second year head coach, younger, who's really building something that feels a little bit different than the previous staff at each school with Notre Dame and Texas in particular. So a little bit of old and new blended together. There's, of course, the other outliers, as you mentioned. LSU, Clemson is still there. Georgia is still there. But even beyond those teams, Miami's in the mix. Florida is in the top 10. What if Oregon goes crazy on the field and starts to wrap up big recruiting battles thereafter? They've got a shot in a crazy dark horse world as well. So there's still a lot to be said. And that's the point of why you said it will be so entertaining. There's still so much to go in this class of 2023, even with 80% of the SI 99 recruits already off the board. You've got 18 still on the board. And then, of course, the flip game. How does that change come November, December, and when we get closer to that early signing period? So there's still a lot out there for a lot of these programs. So excited to dig into the names, the who's, the what's, and play a little hypothetical ball, which is something we're classically trained not to do. But this is CFB Nation, right? We get to do what we want. State of recruiting. Let's flip it upside down, dig into it inside out, just in time for the start of the season.
John, it's an interesting thing you brought up there. You talk about the players that are already committed. There's only 18 of the SI99 that are uncommitted, which I'd be curious to see what that was last year, because I kind of felt like going into last year, after the COVID year, visits opened back up. It seems like a lot of kids were in a rush to make a decision. There's a lot of kids that have made decisions now, but there's still a good number of kids, not only the 18 in the SI99, but as I was talking to you about, who are the next in line guys kind of beating down the door to jump in the SI99. A lot of those kids are uncommitted. And then also with NIL, we're talking about the flip game. Penn State's class, for example, looked a whole lot different a month ago when you look at some of these kids like Tamorian Parker and the quarterback out of Texas or out of Florida that flipped to Florida. So between those uncommitted kids and the potential flip game with NIL, do you think that even adds more to what the shakeup at the top of this recruiting battle and this recruiting race could look like?
Of course. How could it not, right? Because a lot of that stuff will become more clear for the programs, right? As the season wears on. Remember, like you said, this time last year, kind of boring, right? A lot of kids wanted to make that decision before their senior season began. They did. They were committed. And now it was like, okay, sit and wait. And then boom, craziest coaching carousel of all time started happening, and then everything was upside down in every element of college football, including, of course, recruiting. So I don't think we see that craziness because of the carousel, but NIL could have a similar kind of bombing effect to where the ripples of it hit and touch programs coast to coast. And we've seen conference realignment factor into that as well. I think a lot of visits are going to happen later rather than sooner, including with many kids who are verbally committed. Malachi Nelson was at Texas A&M. There's talk he might take other visits as well. And this is a kid who's been tied to Lincoln Riley since like his sophomore year of high school. So there's kids who are, even those seemingly comfortable and done with the process, that are still keeping the door just slightly open. And obviously, when you're talking about these big time college football programs, that's all it takes to create an opportunity and eventual movement within a given recruiting class. So yeah, there still could be a lot ahead for this class of 2023. So I think that's another reason why we've got so many contenders, right? When we play the hypothetical game, the on-field results are going to factor in, right? Particularly with Texas, of these 4 programs. If Texas, is on one extreme or the other, 10 wins or 5 wins like last year, I think you could see some movement where it's like, well, maybe the Arch Manning hype and all that wasn't enough to jump in with Texas. Let's kind of reshuffle the deck now that they are, a borderline bowl team versus a team that should contend in the Big 12. And then vice versa. If things go incredibly well for Texas, who's to say they don't shoot up all the way to number 1 in 2 months, after the Oklahoma game and all that kind of stuff? What if they upset Alabama? I mean, there's so many on-field factors that can factor in with the programs that are contending at the very top. So I think it's going to be fascinating in just about every way. But NIL is going to be that coaching carousel-like factor. And then the carousel will hit again, right? We know that's always going to be a part of it. The precedent of schools, particularly USC and LSU, moving on from their coaches early. I think USC was September. LSU wasn't very long after that. Moving on from them coaches early publicly, I think created a whole lot of divisiveness early on, but kind of worked out for those 2 schools, at least, comparatively. So I'm curious to see if that is a game plan that some of these ADs that are looking at coaches like Scott Frost, Brian Harsin, Mike Norvell, maybe Chip Kelly, some of these coaches that could be right on that bubble. If things don't go their way in September, do they pull the trigger early, to create even more chaos? So yeah, all of that stuff is going to factor into this chase for number 1.
And last year, you say it worked out well for USC and LSU in regard to they went out and got big-time coaches to be their new head coaches, but there were a lot of kids that were in those classes that ended up somewhere else when the dust settled, which again could impact that number 1 ranking. So that's what's going to make this a very, very interesting. What do we got? About 4 months left, John, before the early signing period, and then we'll have a couple months after that. But it's going to certainly be interesting to see how this chase and this race goes down.
100%. And like you said, it does go both ways, right? You have those Oklahoma class was really nice last year before Lincoln Riley's, move to USC, and that class was dismantled so quickly.
Florida's another one. Nick, the Evers kid, the quarterback that I know you were very high on, ends up going to Oklahoma from Florida. Florida's another one that kind of saw their class get decimated a little bit with some of the big names. So that's what I think is going to make this a really fascinating race.
Yes, sir. So let's get into kind of the chalk contenders first, right? Let's get that out of the way before we play the extreme game with the other 2. Let's start with Alabama, right? Obviously, look, Nick Saban's signed a 100-year extension. He's going to coach until
they got to roll him under the bleachers because he's not with us anymore, and he's going to have it in his will that you finish the game and deal with me afterwards. I mean, that's how it's going to be.
It just seems like this isn't even recruiting related. This is just like football wise. If you beat Nick in the national title game, right? Clemson did it. We saw Ohio State do it in the playoff. That following year, it's like worse for everyone else. It's like he's like re-energized in this kind of like Marvel villainous rage that creates a whole lot of recruiting momentum and obviously some on-field success there as well. So on the field, they're like the unanimous number 1. Nobody else even was really under consideration as far as most of the major polls are concerned. But in recruiting, we saw that too. In the summer, Alabama just kind of exploded and came out of nowhere as much as Alabama could come out of nowhere. And they got a 2 quarterback class with Dylan Lonergan and Eli Holstein. They kept big time recruits, of course, within state lines, particularly in the secondary with Jaleel Hurley, Tony Mitchell, some of those great SI-99 recruits. And then they really flexed, I think, the most interesting muscle of this recruiting cycle from the Alabama perspective was going into Georgia and grabbing number one safety in the country, Caleb Downs, and his buddy, good friend, Justice Haynes, who, by the way, is a UGA running back legacy, son of Veron Haynes. That is where you said, okay, this head-to-head with Georgia, it starts to feel personal with Nick. And I think recruiting is reflecting that with this class that I think right now is the safest bet for, that number one ranking in the end. And they've ascended to contention already just with that big summer and some of those most critical victories.
Here's what I find fascinating about this Alabama class. First of all, there's three things for me. Number one, you went into Georgia and got the two kids you talked about, right? That's the team that just beat you for the national championship. Like you said, it's like you might not have wanted to do that to Nick Saban. Number two, the state of Alabama has been slowly starting. Alabama and Arizona are two states that I've noticed in recent years are starting to put out even more high-level talent than in the past. Alabama's always been ahead of Arizona, but they're ascending. I think you had like 4 or 5 at least Alabama kids in your SI 99. I had at least 4 or 5 Alabama kids in my top 100 at Irish Breakdown. The state is producing even more high-level talent, and obviously there's so much so that there's top 100 kids that Alabama is not even pushing for that are going to other places. I think that's something that adds to it. And the third part is what I would like for you to speak about, John. It kind of seemed like in the past, Alabama would, get some kids here and there, and then they would just kind of let the season play out and then make their push late. It seems like this year, one of the things Alabama has done is they've made their run early, which then you say, as far as their push for number one, there's still some closing to be done, but I feel like they're starting from a higher point in regards to high-level talent and the numbers than maybe they have in the past going into the season.
Yeah, two really great points in there. Yeah, the momentum just snapped in the summer. I think in the spring evaluation period, Alabama had like 4 or 5 commitments. And in some of the different, articles we were writing and the mailbags and Q&As, I was getting Alabama fans like, hey, should we be worried that there's only 4 or 5 commits? And of course, that answer even back then was no, it's going to be fine. But even at that point, you're like, you still didn't see them just flipping a switch and running it up to the number one class in the country. And I think the combination of spring visits and certainly summer official visits really helped to propel them to the very top and kind of doubling down on some of the things that are obvious sells from that Alabama perspective. And two, like you said, the state of Alabama, I'm looking at the numbers here. Only 3 states had more SI 99 recruits than Alabama. And Georgia and Texas Georgia and California were not one of those states. And that's a shift. I know it's just the top 99. So obviously it's as you widen the sample, if you go top 200, top 300, those states will overtake Alabama.
Just sheer volume.
But at the very top, Alabama's loaded in 2023. The only states that had more were kind of what you expect. Texas and the state of Florida, I think both had like 17 kids in the 99, but Alabama was right in there thereafter, again, ahead of Georgia and California. Not something we really ever talk about from just a geography and talent acquisition standpoint. So Bama, of course, going to take advantage when the state is loaded like it is. And that leads me into thinking about what's next, what's still ahead for the Crimson Tide. And that's where it starts, within state lines. I'm actually finishing up a mailbag tonight about a package deal. So we talked about kind of the Caleb Downs, Justice Haynes package deal that saw them end up at Alabama committing, I think, 10 days apart in July. Well, somehow a bigger package deal is actually brewing within the state of Alabama lines in Carver Montgomery defensive lineman James Smith and Quay Rousseau, who are both in the 99, both, I think, top 25 overall. So 2 premier defenders tied at the hip. James Smith was at IMG last year. He's now back in Alabama. And the large reason why was to play with his buddy Quay Rousseau one more time before they got to college. And then in that movement, they're like, hey, why don't we just play college ball together? So they both just released their top 6, Alabama, Georgia, chief among them. That will be another Saban versus Kirby Smart battle, probably there in the end, though Florida, Ohio State are a couple dark horses. Auburn is in there as well, but I think that would be considered a major upset if the two were to stick with this package deal. And everything I'm being told is that this is a legitimate package deal of the highest order. One's not going without the other and vice versa. So within that, there's a couple of push-pull elements going on. James Smith has family in Ohio, so he's like, hey, Quay, why don't you come up to Ohio State for an official? And then Quay's got family in Florida, so he's like, hey, how about the Gators? Billy Napier, new coaching staff, come check them out. So I think that almost cancels those two options out. So, of course, in the end, we expect this to be an Alabama-Georgia battle. So if Saban can beat Smart for another package deal head-to-head, I think that would really help propel the Crimson Tide to the very top. A couple other targets out there as well. Samson Okunlola, number 1 offensive tackle. Jalen Hale, a big-time wide receiver who's committing September 21st. So you could kind of put some icing on some of these position groups, if you will, for Alabama. But really, it's going to be about the trenches and capitalizing on that great list of uncommitted recruits in the state of Alabama, led by, again, James Smith and Quay Rousseau.
So let's go to Ohio State. That's the other sort of team that we just every year, Ohio State's right in there with Georgia and Alabama kind of jockeying for that 1, 2, 3, with the exception of the occasional, as we mentioned, the occasional Texas A&M, USC every now and then will sneak in. But for the last 5, 6 years, it's pretty much been those 3 teams jockeying for position. Ohio State's in there now. They were the only team that could really kind of pass Notre Dame for a while when Notre Dame was sitting there constantly being number 1. Ohio State would leap them, then Notre Dame would leap them, Notre Dame would leap them before Alabama made their run. Buckeyes have kind of faded off a little bit, had a decommitment, obviously had a couple decommitments, right? And then just kind of stalled a little bit, but there's still some big pieces out there that Ohio State's still running for that shoots them right back up into this conversation here as we go into the fall and then as we get closer to signing day.
Yeah, kind of unusual for OSU, not only to suffer those decommitments, including in-state tight end who flips to Alabama, of all places, to bring it back to that school, but kind of an unusual class, not in that they've got the best receiver class in the country. That is sort of to be expected, but really weak in the trenches, really light on defense. They've got 0 edge players committed. Now, a lot ahead for Ohio State. They're going to get all the great edges on campus, right?
Sure.
Keon Keeley in 2 weeks, Damon Wilson for that Notre Dame game. Mateo Uiagalelei is going to be back on campus. The Buckeyes squarely in that battle as well. So all is still ahead for Ohio State from an edge rusher perspective, but to have 0 on board right now for Larry Johnson is crazy to look at and consider, because you can't go get them all. You can't go grab all of those guys. So even though they did that at wide receiver, but you can't do that at defensive end and or edge, and that's really the biggest need for the Buckeyes in this class. So really, it kind of, for me, it profiles very, very simply. You've got a great group. Love the receiver class. Love the secondary. Brock Glenn is a nice developmental option at quarterback. The O-line group is good, not great. There's still some targets that could jump on board down the line, potentially. Okunlola, who we talked about, Monroe Freeling, a couple others that are still on the board. But can you hit on multiple edge recruits? If any program can do it, it'll be Larry Johnson and Ohio State. The track record speaks for itself. But the Ohio State pitch, if you will, the case for number 1 is pretty cut and dry. Can you wrap up an elite edge group or can you not? And it could be that simple in the end, because Bama's class is going to elevate just a little bit more. Obviously, Notre Dame's got some skill talent appearing to be on the way. I know we'll talk about that in a little bit. And Texas is kind of the high risk, high reward group of these 4. So if you're staying in the race from the Ohio State perspective, it really comes down to Keon Keeley, Damon Wilson, Mateo Uiagalelei, players like that. Can you jump in and solidify those? Desmond Umeozulu's another one coming off the board here soon. It appears as if maybe Ohio State's slowing down in that front. Right. So are they more confident with the big 3 we talked about? Can you pair these edge rushers with your Jason Moore and your Will Smith, some of the better interior guys that they have on board?
We talked about the season and how that's going to impact certain teams. I actually think, John, that's going to impact Ohio State, not the overall record. Ohio State was good last year. I mean, they were a disappointing 11-2, right? There's a lot of teams that would like to be sort of underachieving as the Rose Bowl champs and an 11-2 team, right? Like a lot of teams would like that, which says a lot about where the Ohio State program is. That 11-2 is considered, we got to make a huge overhaul of our coaching staff because 11-2 is not good enough. But that's exactly right there where I'm talking about. they did have the poor defensive play last year. Brutally bad defense for Ohio State last year by their standards. Second year in a row, they had a really down year on defense. Obviously, they had the great year under Jeff Hafley in 2019. Last 2 years really struggling. Overhaul things. Jim Knowles comes in, right? Bring in 2 new secondary coaches. Larry Johnson is still there, right? The legend Larry Johnson is still there. If Ohio State can bounce back defensively and start to kind of get closer to what they were in 19 and even more so back in 14 and 15 when they were just, I mean, we were talking about this the other day and a buddy of mine says, you're just not going to get 4 studs in the second. I was like, do you remember that team Notre Dame played in the Fiesta Bowl in 2015?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But the team where Marshawn Lynch couldn't get into the starting lineup. Yeah, that's the exception to the rule.
Marshawn Lattimore. Yeah.
Marshawn Lattimore. Excuse me. Yes, Marshawn Lattimore. Couldn't get in the starting lineup. But that's the thing I think for Ohio State is that of Alabama and Ohio State, obviously Alabama is what they are. Ohio State actually think they do have an on-field result that could sway them more than what anything Georgia or Alabama could do because of the fact that they won with a one-dimensional team last year. If Jim Knowles can get that defense rolling, then I think that could be something that could secure their ability to kind of close, because it's about closing, right, John? I mean, you mentioned all those guys. Who right now would you predict they get of that group? It's not a lot of them, right?
Yeah,
so
it's
the
tough.
product on the field is going to be very important for Ohio State this year on defense.
Yeah, it's a great point. And look, they've got everything in front of them, obviously, right? The offense is going to be as explosive as anything we've ever seen. And they've got the best early season game. Let's be honest, the best potential for that early season atmosphere with Notre Dame coming to town, all the storylines and how small the numbers will be next to these programs' names when they do finally face off here soon. That visitor list, that atmosphere is going to be nuts. So how well do you capitalize off of that? I think will say a lot about Ohio State. But yeah, it's hard to predict today any one of those edges ending up at Ohio State, like in a very secure fashion. Keon Keeley, more Bama buzz. There's still Florida buzz with Keon Keeley. Damon Wilson, Alabama, Miami, very much involved in that race. Georgia, another one in that conversation. And then with Uiagalelei, he's an LA kid. USC, heavy on him. Oregon, heavy on him. His brothers at Clemson, they're in the mix there. So you could really build the case almost against any of those elite pass rushers ending up in Columbus. But of course, they will all be on campus one more time, and you feel good about their chances once they do get them back in town, but you still got to close. And I think the on-field product, that's a great point, BD. The on-field product will say something about it, because if you get killed defensively again, even with the overhaul, now all of a sudden it becomes more of a structural question.
Is Ryan Day Lincoln Riley? That's exactly the conversation.
That's where you start to lose in the margins, because when you start comparing that to the Sabans and the Smarts and some of these other coaching staffs, that question doesn't exist. The organizational CEO on down question is really the only one besides the national championship that Ryan Day has yet to fully answer in Sharpie. Right. So I think there's a lot at stake for him this year. He probably knows that relative to what he's already experienced in Columbus and losing to Michigan last year on top of it. So I do think that it's really fascinating on the field for Ohio State, more than people realize. You're convincing me as we talk about it. I like it.
But if it goes right, though, it's the flip argument. Hey, look at the hires he made. He pushed all the right buttons. Yeah, that's a guy that I believe in, because if we do something doesn't go right, he's going to make the changes and get it right. That's what Urban did, right? Like, Urban made some bad hires in his tenure. Everett Withers wasn't that guy at defensive coordinator. So what does he do? Gets rid of him, brings in Chris Ash, national championship. Promotes Tim Beckett and Ed Warner to co-offensive coordinators. They get blown out 31-0 in the college football playoff. What does he do? Gets rid of him, goes out and brings this guy named Ryan Day in, right? Kevin Wilson. Now, all of a sudden, fast forward 5 years later, and you're talking about Ohio State having the best offense in college football. So, the Urban was able to do that. Can Ryan Day push those buttons? I think that's one of those last things that he needs to prove as a head coach. Is he just a great offensive mind, or is he a great head coach? I don't think Lincoln Riley's ever shown that. Lincoln Riley's shown he's a great offensive mind, but he hasn't been able to push those buttons to get the defense going. I think if Ryan Day can do that, all of a sudden, a lot of the questions that seem to be existing right now for Ohio State on defense get answered. And I think you could see Ohio State close at a really high rate, and not just close on the guys on the board, John, but then, hey, so-and-so kid committed elsewhere.
Yeah.
Remember those doubts you had when you chose such and such school this summer? We proved you wrong. And that's the other part of it that I think like I said, of Notre Dame, of this conversation, I think Notre Dame and Texas, and Ohio State all have a lot that they need to prove on the field, and that hasn't been the case for Ohio State in recent years, and I think that could have a big impact. And if you're the Buckeyes, you're in a good place, right? I mean, you're still a top 3 to 4 program with questions. If you answer those questions, you're going to see them make a run.
Yeah, the ball's in your court. It's totally in your court. So everything's in front of you. And again, the schedule is in front of you too. It sets up better for you than just about any other team that we're talking about in this conversation. So it's really on you to make it or break it. So yeah, that'll be fascinating.
So let's transition into those other two teams, John. We talked about the sort of the old guard, right? It's funny to talk about Notre Dame and Texas as not part of the old guard, but we're referring to old guard in regard to looking at the last decade. Who are the teams that are just every year seem to be in that competition for a top recruiting class? Alabama and Ohio State have proven that. Two other teams trying to show that they belong in that conversation. That's Notre Dame and Texas. Let's start off with the Longhorns, John, because I think the obviously getting Arch Manning was huge for Texas. But they had a window right after his commitment to say, let's make our run. And boy, did they ever.
Yeah, I think they had 8 verbal commitments, and he became number 9. Texas is now up to 22 in the class of 2023, and a lot of those guys have flat out said it. Even prospects who weren't considering Texas, and they're not committed. Like Damon Wilson, we talked about earlier, he flat out said, after Arch Manning committed to Texas, I called up Texas, and now 2 months later, Texas is in his final 5. Look, total underdog and probably not going to win, but that literally got the Longhorns back in the conversation. They stopped recruiting it. I mean, it was unbelievable. But anyway, the Arch Manning effect resonated about as well as anybody could have predicted. A lot of offensive firepower has jumped on board. Number 1 running back Cedric Baxter, top 3 or 4 receiver Jonte Cook has jumped on board. A bevy of offensive linemen, I think 5 offensive linemen jumped on board. And then they're also now able to dip into Louisiana a little bit more because it's Arch Manning, it's New Orleans. So you get, Derek Williams, one of the top 2 or 3 safeties in the country. You were in it for Jordan Matthews. There's some flip buzz there after his commitment to Tennessee. So now the defense is starting to benefit from the Arch Manning situation. So yeah, it's a total galvanizing moment for Texas. Totally took advantage of it. But now, again, the season is here. So you won the offseason. I don't think there's any doubt that Texas was the offseason recruiting winner in the sport. I mean,
John, I want to point this out to you, John, to back up your point. Arch Manning committed to Texas on June 23rd. That was their 9th commitment. By July 4th, which is less than 2 weeks later,
right,
they had landed 10 more kids. They landed more kids in the week and a half to 2 weeks after Arch committed than they had landed up to that point in time when Arch committed. That was, and like you said, it was a quality pickups, and that just really, like you said, that changed the complete. You expect Bama's run to come. Texas making that run and beating Bama and Georgia to do it. That's the other part of this, John, because in order to get these top-ranked classes, this is what people have to understand. In order to beat Bama in the rankings, you have to beat Bama on the trail. To beat Georgia and Ohio State in the rankings, you have to beat them on the trail. And Texas did that with Arch, and then that allowed them to do that with some other kids because of Arch. And it was really an outstanding run. But as you said, now they've got to go show that the program is trending in the right direction.
Yeah, and perhaps fittingly, Alabama's coming to town September 10th, and that will be, by all indication, a humbling time for Steve Sarkisian and company. But can you contend? Can you compete in that game? Can you flash with Quinn Ewers and company with who knows how many recruits? I mean, you talk about early season big games. How many kids will be at UT when Alabama comes to town? That will be as star-studded a recruiting event as there is relative to one game this year. Again, Ohio State, Notre Dame, probably
those are the two.
Those other clear kind of like number 1 candidate in their own right. But that's part of it too. What does the atmosphere look like? What do those kids feel like? Do you go into that locker room after the game, Steve Sarkisian, presumably taking an L on the field, and do you feel emotionally like, hey, we're getting there, like we're heading in the right direction? And can that be translated and visible to all the fans, the recruits, mom and dad, the parents, the high school coaches, the mentors, the 7-on-7 coaches, the illegal street agents, everyone in between, do they kind of say, oh, this is different. This is different for Texas. This isn't Sam Ehlinger saying we're back after a mediocre bowl win. This is a legitimate, okay, Texas has a chance here. If it feels like that on September 10th into the night, the morning, I should say, of the 11th, then all of a sudden you feel a lot better about the chances of Texas finishing number one. Because if it's the opposite, and if it's oh my God, this was a great offseason run, but long way to go, UT, and all of a sudden you're losing Big 12 games and you can't get over the Kansas hump. Oklahoma, even, with a retooled coaching staff, takes you down again. If it starts to feel like that, you could see the wheels falling off because you're recruiting high-level players. And that's what you said earlier. The quality you've brought in, just as much as it was a big deal when they committed, they still have all those options. Jonte Cook could call A&M tomorrow, and they're going to say yes. Derek Williams can call LSU tomorrow, and they'll say yes, son. Stay in state. Malik Muhammad, an elite corner, can absolutely end up somewhere else. Cedric Baxter is from Orlando, Florida. You don't think he can call up the Gators or anyone else, Florida State, where he was once committed? Absolutely. So the wheels can fall off just as impressively as they were put on after that Arch Manning verbal commitment. So it's clearly the program that has the most to gain or lose on the field. And look, Texas also has some kids that are uncommitted that are potentially ahead. I think that's what's interesting about their approach as well. David Hicks, a big-time player in state. We mentioned Damon Wilson has them somehow in his final five. He's never been to campus, so maybe he gets out there. Deuce Robinson, number one tight ends. It's USC or Texas, it feels like right now. And then Jalen Hale, another big-time receiver in the SI 99 we talked about, coming off the board on the 21st. Texas battling Alabama and Georgia and A&M in that recruitment. So again, head-to-head wins against the programs you're trying to be is a predicator for how you might fare on the field one day.
For me, it's two things have to happen for Texas. This game against Alabama has to look a lot like the 2019 game against LSU, that great LSU team in 2019. Texas didn't win the game, but they played LSU to the wire. The crowd was crazy live that night. You could just hear it watching the television. You're like, wow. Like I would have loved. I've been in that stadium, and when that crowd gets going, it's a cool place to be at, right? Obviously, it didn't end up real well for Notre Dame, but so I know what that crowd is like when things are going well. You could hear it in the 2019 game. I don't even think they have to win. I think they just have to compete with Bama, and then the pitch is, hey guys, we're closer than people think. We just need you to come here instead of going there to do that. Then they have to follow that up by handling your business at the next three games. Handle your business against Texas San Antonio. Handle your business against Texas Tech. Handle your business against West Virginia. Then you've got the Red River rivalry on October 8th. They have been very competitive against Oklahoma in recent years, in spite of the fact that they gave that game away. Yeah. If they can handle their business after Alabama, assuming that game is competitive, if they can handle their business against Oklahoma, then you got Iowa State that next week, who is not as good this year. That could put Texas on a run. And that's why, for me, they're my dark horse playoff contender this year. And look, they've got some holes on their roster, but they've got enough firepower, and the schedule sets up the way it has. Oklahoma State's not going to be quite as good as they were last year. Another game Texas should have won. They get Kansas State on the road. Kansas State's a good football team, but Texas has more talent.
There's more talent, yeah. Always.
Right. They get Baylor at home. Baylor lost a ton of kids in the NFL. So if they can just survive that Bama game and just be competitive, there's not a game left on their schedule. They can't win if they can prove that they know how to win. They should have been, if you talk about just games they led in the fourth quarter last year, what's their record? 9-3?
Yeah.
10-2? So I think Texas has got a chance, but it's going to come down to the Bama game, because I think a competitive loss or a win against Alabama does a lot for that Texas team, like we've seen in the past, whether it was Clemson beating Notre Dame in 2015 that kind of was the final nail in the Clemsoning coffin, right? Was Notre Dame even have it? But then Bama, what was it really that set Clemson off? It was that close loss to Alabama that made people realize, hey, you know what? Clemson's legit. It was Notre Dame taking Georgia down to the wire in 2017 that gave that team a lot of confidence to go out there and just curb stomp everybody they played for the next month and a half. I think that could have the same galvanizing impact for Texas. And if that happens, Texas is going to be really hard to beat for some of those kids. And I would not want to be a team that had a commitment. I would not want to be Texas A&M sitting there with a kid that Texas wanted if that happens, because I think it's going to be hard. I think kids are just waiting on Texas to be good again. Just look, show me you're good again. And, and I think that's going to be the case. But that's why that Bama game, to your point, John, is huge. But the Oklahoma game looms every bit as large, in my opinion.
And this is the year to get them. This is the year, if you're going to get Oklahoma, get over that hump and all that, this is the year to do it. Transition at the top where it creates more doubt in the Sooners preseason than I have seen like in my whole life, right? We always kind of know what we're getting with OU. And now all of that is on its head. Brent Venables, a defensive guy, brings in Jeff Lebby. That's a high tempo, very fast offense. How easy is that to install year one, with the quarterback's familiar with Dylan Gabriel, but who else is, nobody else. So you're going to rely on youth. You're going to rely on transfers in that regard. So this is the year from a talent perspective where I think Texas clearly has more talent than Oklahoma. And that's not something we've been able to say over the long haul of the last 10, 15 years. So this is also the year to get Oklahoma, and the timing couldn't line up any better for Sarkisian and Texas relative to recruiting and relative to what's ahead in potentially a Big 12 title type season.
Now, the team that's had the number one spot for most of this recruiting cycle is Notre Dame. Obviously, Alabama's run, and then Notre Dame losing Keon Keeley has dropped them down, but they're still in that second, third, fourth conversation. Some big names still left on the board, John. This is a different Notre Dame class than we've seen. Even with the loss of Keon Keeley, it still has more points than any Notre Dame class in the last decade, outside of a class that had a guy named Jalen Smith, another dude named Will Fuller, another dude named Mike McGlinchey. I don't know if you've heard of those guys or not.
Not bad.
They were decent. So Marcus Freeman is doing some things there, right? Can he be the difference between Notre Dame's had some highly ranked classes early in the past, load up, and then they're done as everybody else catches up. That seems a little bit different for Notre Dame this year, John. It seems like there's still some big-time targets still left on the board. For Marcus Freeman, more than anybody else in this conversation, I would argue the close is going to be the key, because it's not just adding players, but then keeping everybody else from picking at your carcass if you're not able to go out there and do what you need to do on the football field this year.
Right. And that's the one unanswered question we really have with Marcus as a recruiter, as the head coach, organizing the numbers, playing the margins, and making that final call on who to push for, who to back off of in the final analysis. That's really what we don't have from his track record. Everything individually looks great, but how do you close there at the 11th hour? But look, from the makeup perspective, this class has just about everything. I would love to see a quarterback in here. I think that's really the biggest hole compared to the other three teams we've talked about. All those other schools, Arch Manning, obviously Brock Glenn, Lonergan, and Eli Holstein. All those other schools, you got your quarterback. Notre Dame, it looked like they were going to get one, and then they didn't. They've got a great one in 24, but what about 23? That's really the only glaring hole left. But when you talk about positional units, and we talk about this a lot, right? Love Bama's DB haul. Ohio State's receiver haul is ridiculous. Texas's O-line haul, really, really good. The receiver haul will be really great as well. These Notre Dame position groups are awesome. I love the wide receiver board that they have been able to put together. And to my understanding, it's not quite done yet. So you've got great size, you've got polish, nice combination of upside with Braylon James and Greathouse and some of these guys, but now you need some juice and a little bit more athleticism, maybe a smaller type prospect.
Like
Notre Dame has that ahead of it.
Maybe Dylan Edwards.
Teeing it up.
I mean, they're and then Tayshawn Lyons is the one that you referred to, who's a kid from California, top 200-ish kind of kid right now, but had 28 catches last year. 16 of them went for touchdowns, to your point, John. And two of those kids were SI-99 players, I believe, right? Braylon James and Jane Greathouse, right?
Yeah, both receivers, clear SI-99 players. That stat line reminds me of Jaden Waddle. I think he had 34 catches as a senior, 17 went for touchdowns. So it's not about the long-standing statistical value, but when you're scoring every other time or close thereafter, I mean, that's kind of crazy. And again, when we talk about perception, that's what we've been asking for from Notre Dame. The defensive recruiting has been amazing. O-line, tight end, no questions, like really ever with those positional groups. Can you get the galvanizing receivers who change the feel And then can you bring in some skill position talent thereafter, running back, quarterback, etc., to make Notre Dame feel different athletically and offensively, kind of simultaneously. And I think this class has brought a lot of that out in the Irish. Love, obviously, 7 SI99 recruits right now, same as Alabama, I believe the same as Ohio State as well. So right there at the very top, Texas is the one that's creeping up the list in their own right, with some of the guys that are still ahead on the board. So when you talk about the elite recruits committed and then the elite positional groups, really like what Notre Dame has done. Again, wide receiver, O-line is shored up as any position for any school in the country. Love the linebackers, Drake Bowen, a monster. Peyton Bowen could end up as the number 1 or 2 safety when all is said and done. I think he's number 2 for us right now. It could very much challenge Caleb Downs, which is not something I ever thought I would say in this class of 23.
Did you see his pick 6 on Thursday night, by the way, for Peyton Bowen?
Yeah. He got one, and then little bro got one. Yeah. Eli in the same game.
I'm not gonna lie to you. Eli's was a little bit more impressive because he flat out took the ball from the dude and then took it back to the house.
Eli's was a weight room. Peyton was watch me work, kind of track speed, the instincts to trigger, to break on the ball, and just make it look so easy and effortless. I think speaks very highly of his upside and probably freshman year impact ability there at Notre Dame. But yeah, this class has a little bit of everything, all the variants you want, national footprint, just need a little bit more skill position. And, the quarterback question, when does that come back around? Do you allow somebody to emerge, somebody change their mind, stuff like that, all still potentially on the board for the Irish. And if that position is solidified, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to keep them. They're not number 4 right now, but if we were doing a ranking, it'd be very hard to keep them off of that top 1 or 2 if those answers if those questions are answered here in the next couple months.
You made a couple. First of all, if you could kind of take what you have, if you can match the 23 recruiting at quarterback with what you've done in 24, that's exactly what you're talking about, right? But you also talked about something else, John, that I thought was interesting, because what is the one thing that you always hear about Notre Dame, whether it's true or not? What's the one thing you always hear about Notre Dame? They still have enough speed on the perimeter.
Right.
When you watch the Rose Bowl in 2020 against Alabama, it was painfully obvious for Notre Dame fans that you don't have enough athleticism on either side of the ball. I mean, you've got big Ben Skoranek size, Javon McKinley size, tight end, and you had these big guys, Michael Mayer, and then on the, Kyle Hamilton. But after Kyle Hamilton's like, your athletes just can't hang with those athletes on the perimeter. You've got your Jeremiah Usacore-Moas, you had NFL guys in the D line, but you couldn't hang on the perimeter. I think that's the thing that stands out to me. You're talking about Peyton Bowen ran a 4.38 at Notre Dame's camp last summer. You saw the speed on that play. From an electronic time and track time, he is the 3rd fastest kid in this Notre Dame class. He lost, and you saw it, he lost to Dylan Edwards at the Future 50 in the 40. Dylan Edwards had an even faster time. That's a kid that had 2,600 yards rushing last year and 38 touchdowns and averaged over 12 yards a carry. And then the fastest guy in the class is another kid from Texas, Micah Bell, who has run in the 10.3 range and the 100 consistently in the 10.4s and ran a 20.89 in the 200-meter dash this year. The same day, he ran a 10.46 in the 100. The same day, he jumped 24.5 feet in the long jump. Same day. I think that's the thing that we're seeing from Marcus Freeman last year and this year, the Jalen Sneeds, the Josh Burnhams, like raising Ben Morrison, Jaden Mickey, raising that athleticism level. And this class, with the DBs we just mentioned, Peyton Bowen, Micah Bell, Christian Gray, there's 2 players in the top 60 of the SI99, a linebacker, and Drake Bowen, Jane Alsbury. They can both run.
They can cover. They can
cover. Braylon James, most years at a 4.47 electronic, is the fastest receiver that Notre Dame has signed. He is not the fastest receiver in this class. So I think, and then if they can add Jeremiah Love, the burner from St. Louis, I think that's the biggest thing that Marcus Freeman is doing, that he needs to hold on to the guys that we just talked about, and then add a Jeremiah Love and a quarterback. Now, all of a sudden, you're seeing Notre Dame add that influx of speed that you see Alabama do constantly, that you see Georgia and Ohio State and Clemson do constantly, that Notre Dame does a guy here, a Kyle Hamilton, a Will Fuller, a Chris Tyree, but not doing it year after year after year. I think that's what this class adds. And I think that more than anything is why Notre Dame's in this conversation, because you look at the SI99 guys, John, you said there's 7 of them, 2 receivers, 2 DBs, 2 linebackers. There's only 1 offensive lineman from Notre Dame's class in the SI 99. As good as that line class is,
right?
6 skill players in that. That's the difference for me.
That's how you draw it up.
Right, exactly.
That's how you draw it up from a desirable perspective for Notre Dame. And that's the day you hear they're going to hire Marcus Freeman, that's the first thing that came to my mind was they're going to go bolder and faster and younger and be able to go out and compete athletically like they never have before. And we're seeing it immediately. And I think that is another great sign, again, as we try to figure out, still first-year head coach, we still try to figure out, what he is as a recruiter. I think the identification and prioritization level early in the cycle showed us a lot. Now, like you said, it's about retention, closing on some of these final uncommitted recruits where Notre Dame is favored for a couple guys that are only going to enhance this class of 2023 and enhance in those areas, in those margins that we've been asking for more from Notre Dame from quite some time. So fitting that this is the chance for a number one class immediately after the coaching change, first full cycle before the season even gets here. We're talking about ND as a possible number one recruiting program. And I think the day Freeman took the job, that should have been the first thought. Does this now put you from, hey, we're always in that 5 to 15 range to now we can throw up some top threes in the conversation, because that's where it's different, because you're going to have Bama in there always. You're going to have Georgia, Ohio State always there. Can you spoil and get above one of them on a relatively consistent, even if it's an every other year basis? You're in the playoff every few years. I mean, sometimes it's just that simple. So it's fitting that this class at Notre Dame has been number one the longest. And again, if they answer a couple of the remaining questions, they're going to have a chance to hit it there on the back end.
And one of those questions also has to be, John, like everybody not named Alabama and Georgia, I do think there's an on-field aspect that needs to be proven as well. Can he take Notre Dame into Columbus and do what Brian Kelly never did, which is compete on the big stage? Win or lose, I look at that game for Notre Dame a lot like the Alabama game for Texas.
Agree.
You don't necessarily have to win, although a win is monumental, but you have to compete. You have to show, hey, so-and-so, you're the difference between us losing that game by 3 and us winning it next year when Ohio State comes to our place. And then you have to go beat a Clemson. You at some point in time, Notre Dame has to be defined by the games they won, not the games they were competitive again in. And they were competitive twice against Georgia. And then Brian Kelly liked to claim, well, we didn't lose to Clemson in 2018 as badly as Alabama lost to them, and we didn't lose to Alabama in 2020 as bad as Ohio State lost to them. That's not what you want to be kind of banging on the table saying we're getting closer, right? It's got to be starting.
Not your head coach. Not your head coach. That's for us. That's for us to play around with and message boards, but not your head coach. No.
But that's what they need to do. The on-field results have to start looking like those other teams. So for Texas and Notre Dame especially, yeah, you've got the momentum, young, brilliant, offensive mind in Sark, who has a ring as a coordinator somewhere else. And you've got your quarterback, and there's some momentum there, but he's got to go prove it on the field. And I think the same thing is true for Marcus Freeman, especially since he inherited a program that has won 10 games each of the last 5 years. It's like, hey, can you keep this ball rolling, maybe even take it to another level? If he can show that, then I think he makes the original question you had about closing. I think he answers that. But again, this is a show me business, and players can think you're cool and hip and I like you and respect you and I think you care about us. But at the end of the day, can I win a championship with you? And can you send me the NFL? And those are questions that Marcus Freeman still has to answer.
100%. But like you said, with what he inherited, that's a great point at Notre Dame. It creates more benefit of the doubt. All those things, even you feel better about Notre Dame's chances to win some of those battles because of that stability that we usually don't get when we're talking about a first-year head coach. It's usually a Mario Cristobal trying to figure out why Miami can't recruit local kids.
Right.
It's usually this crazy overhaul, not quite the same situation at Notre Dame. That absolutely should be said. And that's why you have an opportunity right out of the gates before you coach your first game to be in that mix for the number one recruiting ranking, which is, again, something I've never talked about in 12 years doing this, covering, wondering if Notre Dame has a chance at that type of spot. It's been SEC heavy with a sprinkle of Ohio State and Clemson, and that's kind of it.
John, I want to ask you this question. Last question as we look at this. Is there a dark horse out there? In your opinion, you say, it's not likely, but if the stars align in some different aspects, this could be a team that could come next or December, as we kind of saw A&M make that crazy run down the stretch with all the kids they landed in the last 2 signing days. Is there a team like that with how the season plays out and other factors could maybe be that dark horse that not a lot of people are talking about? Is there a program that you could see doing that, coming out of nowhere and saying, hey, we're going to make a run at this bad boy?
How about a team going to A&M here in a few weeks in the Miami Hurricanes? And I know you teed me up for that one, but when we talk about elite recruiting, what's ahead on the field and great position groups, Miami's kind of hitting all those marks from the potential department under Mario Cristobal, who's already known as a great recruiter. When you talk about great positional groups nationally, the very best ones, we talk about Ohio State's receiver group, Notre Dame's offensive line, maybe their receiver group, as well as it materializes. The Miami offensive line group is becoming a part of that conversation. And they, like Alabama, have paired it with a 2-quarterback class, including a top 10 overall recruit in the sometimes polarizing Jaden Rashada. You've got your banner position or premium position players elsewhere as well, with Jaden Wayne as one of the edge rushers. You've got dynamic receivers in Robbie Washington and Nathaniel Joseph already committed. So can you hit the next level? They've got huge targets out there. They've got Okunlola still on the board. Monroe Freeling is still on the board for Miami offensively. They've got to hit wide receiver a little bit harder. Hakeem Williams is on the board for them. Jaylen Brown is an LSU commit that they're still communicating with. 2 SI99 recruits right there. If you could solidify that group and spur that into a little bit more success in the secondary, where, look, you're in South Florida. I mean, there is talent all around you. Damari Brown is 1 county north at American Heritage. There's a lot of Damon Fagan you're trying to flip from NC State, who's a teammate of his. There's a lot ahead for Miami from a secondary perspective as well. But like Texas and like some of these other schools, it's got to align on the field as well. You've got to go, same thing we said about Texas playing Bama, Notre Dame playing Ohio State. You got to go to Kyle Field, first-year head coach at this school, all that stuff considered. You got an NFL quarterback and a lot of weapons. You got to contend and compete with the Aggies, who, let's be honest, every year I'm like, where is all this hype coming from? I know they just signed the number 1 class, but the on-field hype, still haven't named a quarterback. A lot of defensive attrition from that really great group we saw in 2021 that
including their coordinator.
Alabama. And the coordinator on top of it, by the way. So I just think there's so much question mark surrounding that Texas A&M program that Miami's got a chance in this thing. They've got an explosive offense. They've got an NFL quarterback who's got weapons. They hit the portal hard as well, as you would expect, given the transition. They've got a chance to not only compete, but win that game in College Station. So again, you talk about a galvanizing moment. We know from the last, 40 years, it doesn't take much for Miami to feel like they're back. And it doesn't take much to sell that, given how fertile it is a grounds they recruit on. It feels a lot like Texas in this argument, to where, man, if that thing clicks, it could be the story of the entire college football season. And recruiting will, of course, reciprocate off of that. But the current group is clearly a top 10 group for the Canes. Again, maybe the best O-line class in the country, but there's still holes to fill. No running backs committed. They need more juice at receiver and in the secondary. But if it all
think about that, John. Think about what you just said. Where's Miami lacking in recruiting class right now? Perimeter.
And the skill position.
Perimeter.
That's nuts.
That may hold them back this year in the race for number 1, but that's going to set them up for the future, because that's where I think Miami's been lacking. And I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions about the U. When it was the U. Yes, they had the Michael Irvins and the Melvin Brattons in the 80s, and they had the Lamar Thomases and guys like that. And then in the 2000s, it was Reggie Wayne and Santana Moss, and it was Ed Reed. But Miami could always punch you in the mouth in the trenches.
And run the ball.
Yes, and on both sides of the ball. And that's what's been lacking from Miami. I mean, they've had some really big-time D linemen, but they're like edge rushers, finesse guys. Their O-line has not been good in a long time, and their D-line has not been as good as it should be when you look at the talent they've had. The fact that Mario Cristobal that's where he's loading up right now is sending a message. And we did a prediction show at Irish Breakdown recently. We actually predicted Miami to win the Coastal. if they win the Coastal and they beat one of A&M or Clemson on the road, or at least hang with both of those, and then handle their business at home, against Pitt, against Florida State, if Miami can be a 9-10 win team this year, that's how let's say LSU struggles a little bit under Brian Kelly with all the turnover they had. And all of a sudden it's like, hey, Jaylen Brown, look what we did. This is where you want to be, and do with him like you did with Nathaniel Joseph, flipping him from Clemson.
Right.
I think that's the thing that could make them. That's why they're the dark horse for me. They've established the trenches in this class. Now, because I think skill players I've always found are a little bit easier to flip.
They're more fluid, 100%. 100%.
And so if that's where you need to flip, and I think part of it is because linemen tend to make decisions based even more so on the position coach and that relationship and that bond. Like, you're not flipping an offensive lineman from Notre Dame, right? I mean, it's not with Harry Heastand here. It's just not going to happen. Right. But can you flip a receiver? Can you flip a corner, a DB? I think that's where Miami could get dangerous. If they can show promise, they don't have to win 11 games. Just show, hey, look, we're going to get this thing turned around. I think Miami could be a team that you don't want to have a committed kid that Miami wants if they win 9-10 games this year. If you're anyone not named Alabama, Georgia, and maybe that might be the end of the list right there, John.
And the one question we are still waiting to answer with Freeman and Sarkisian, that we know that answer in Miami. We know Cristobal can close. Right. He flipped a couple recruits very late, days after he took the Miami job, and obviously is off to a great start in this class of 23. That part we know of. So I think that's where, again, when you put the on-field product together, that's where it becomes a legitimate high upside program where, this could be the premier team recruiting in the ACC above Clemson, which is something that obviously nobody's been able to do for the last 6-7 years.
So, John, let's transition and wrap up with a new feature here on the State of Recruiting podcast, yes, and that is the State of Recruiting Comp Series, where John is going to take a player that in this 2023 class, and as we transition to the next class, and just say kind of, as you look, is there a comp that just comes home, John? I know you and I are on the same page on one thing: hate forced comps. But sometimes you're watching a kid and you're like, you and I had this conversation last year at Notre Dame at Tobias Merriweather, who was a SI 99 kid, top 50 kid for you at SI 99. And you're just like, I can't help but think of T. Higgins every time I watch this kid play. It just comes to you. And you've got some kids that you think that are great comps for. And we're going to start that series tonight. And your first comp that you want to make is for, I believe, the top receiver in the country on the SI 99. That is Brandon Inniss, who is currently an Ohio State commit, John. So who's the comp and what do you see?
Yeah, heck of a place to start with. Brandon Inniss, maybe the kid I've seen the most in this class of 2023. So naturally, like you said, it just kind of comes to you. And when you watch Brandon Inniss, who's a verified 6 foot, 185, 190 pounds or so, when you watch him, he doesn't strike you coming off the bus. He doesn't strike you in his pre-snap stance. He might not even strike you thereafter, but when the ball is in the air and all things are even, whether he's got a DB draped all over him or it's a little bit stretching towards that catch radius, he is there. And then you start to watch his route construction and the polish and the lower body dominance. And it just, the more we watched him, the more we were like, this is kind of John Mechie-ish. John Mechie, the former Alabama receiver who's now with the Houston Texans, second-round draft pick just this past spring, he was kind of the glue. Everyone talked about Jamison Williams at Alabama like, oh, my gosh, he's blowing the top off of the defense, all this stuff. Mechie was the glue guy. He was the counter. He was 3rd and 6, catch it over the middle, absorb a hit, move the chains type of target, the safety outlet, security blanket for Bryce Young in that Heisman campaign. And there's really not one elite trait about John Mechie. Official combine measurements, 5'11", 187. He didn't run the 40, but he's in that 4.5 range. Nothing screams elite singularly. But everywhere else, John Mechie is right on the doorstep and highly, highly productive and safe on top of that. So if you're putting out a grade, a letter grade for every trait that you would create in a wide receiver, right? What are the most important ones, Brian? We talk about polish, the ability to come out of your breaks, hands, body control, awareness, speed, the ability after the catch. on all those fronts, just about, John Mechie's like an A-, B+. Nothing is like, oh my gosh, put him there, number one, don't even worry about it. And when we talk about Brandon Inniss, it's like the same thing. Nothing is sexy. Like nothing is super flashy with the kid, but you look up and he's got 9 catches for 210 yards on a nationally televised type of game. So there's nothing individually relative to his traits that screams, I'm the best receiver in this class. But when you collectively put it all together, it's really hard to poke a hole in Brandon Inniss's game. He is an elite route runner, an elite physical player, whether it's at the catch point or even as a blocker, something we don't talk about nearly enough when we talk wide receivers. The catch radius is elite. The body control along the sidelines and awareness is as good as it gets in this class. He's just not 6'4" and running by everybody. But everything else you ask for at the position, which again, when we translate it to the college game, not the NFL, that's what we're talking about. Which guys are going to be great? Which guy at receiver? Which guys are going to catch 150 balls in college? And the first name that I'm throwing up in that conversation is Brandon Inniss. Just like in the draft class last year, a lot more buzz for the Ohio State guys, Jamison Williams, all these other players. And I'm like, John Mechie's going to catch a bunch of balls for a long time. Now, he's had some health issues. He's fighting leukemia, my goodness, at this point. Hopefully speedy recovery there. But just on the field, you just feel like, man, this is a safe, reliable option. Because, again, we get lost in the 9 routes and the deep balls and the 40 times and all that, which is great. But football is about 3rd and 7. 3rd and 7, your first read, or that receiver who has the awareness to break off his route relative to the blitz that's incoming and makes that play in the margins. That's what the game is about, the intermediate passing game. And in this class of 2023, there is no player I'd rather have in that regard than Brandon Inniss. And that's a lot of the same stuff we would say about John Mechie the last few years at Alabama, and hopefully for him going forward at the NFL level. So like you said, BD, the best comps are organic. They're not forced. You're not just trying to put someone in a height and weight and 40 time and shuttle time box. It's about the feel.
In the game,
how they play the game.
Yeah.
There's a catch John Mechie made against Miami, I think game 1 last year, a rare off-target ball from Bryce Young, and it was just a total incompletion. But Mechie snapped, his front leg and went back against the grain towards the sidelines and snagged it for a first down on it was 3rd and 6 and 3rd and 7, kind of that same marginal play. And you're just like, that won't make any highlight reels, but man, that's important to keep the sticks moving and keep things rolling. I think he actually scored a touchdown like 2 plays later. So not scary in any one category, but collectively, they'll just give you nightmares when you get into the film and you get into the 4-quarter matchup that is Brandon Inniss and or a John Mechie.
I don't think it's a coincidence, John, that in the 2 games in which Alabama did not have John Mechie, that Bryce Young threw 4 touchdowns and 3 picks. Yes, good teams, right? But I don't think that's a coincidence because, as you said, you had a redshirt freshman quarterback. That was his security blanket. He was to that offense what tight ends tend to be for a lot of other offenses. That, hey, I get in 3rd and 6. I just got to get it in John Mechie's direction, as the play that you talked about. And doing it that early in the season sends a message to your new quarterback. Hey, man, just get it near us and we're going to go get this thing. And you mentioned the 100 balls. John Mechie had 96 catches last year and didn't play in Alabama's last 2 games. He's unreal. Well over 100 catches. And I think if he doesn't get hurt, I think Alabama's national champs. I do. I think that they beat Georgia in the championship game if just one of those 2 receivers stays healthy. I know Georgia fans may not like that, and I can't prove that. That's just kind of how it felt like the game was going early, and we saw what they did in the SEC title game. But to your point, that is a quarterback's best friend, a guy that I don't have to be perfect all the time. I'm getting pressure. Where's Brandon Inniss? Where's John Mechie? I think those guys in today's game are every bit as valuable and sometimes more so than the Tyreek Hills, who's a phenomenal player. But a quarterback wants that guy that I know I can go to in any situation, any circumstance. I don't have to be precise with my timing, my read, or my accuracy every time I throw him the ball. And I think you're absolutely right. And I didn't see it at first, John, because most of the film I watched of Brandon early was It's quarterback film.
Right.
And because he's not a super twitchy kid, a big kid, like I said, like got that Tyler Williams track, sprinting thing. He doesn't have the super suddenness and explosiveness of a Nathaniel Branch or Zachariah Branch, excuse me. He doesn't have those traits. It's just that is a position, as much as any in football, that is every much the technical, cerebral needs just as much as the physical needs. And I think that's what separates Brandon Inniss. That's why he's my number one quarterback in the class. I think it's why he's your number one quarterback in the class. And I think the John Mechie comp makes a lot of sense because the other thing you talk about, once Mechie got the ball in his hands, basically turned into a running back.
Right.
And I see a lot of that in Brandon Inniss. And that's where you see that quarterback play last year transition because he would take that thing and just say, okay, I got the ball now. Let me go do something with it. And strong lower half. I mean, that's the other thing you talk about. That strong lower half is another reason he's dangerous in open space. And just a guy you want in your team. So I really like that Brandon Inniss comp right there. That's a good one to start with.
I think Brandon's a good example too of, like you said, first of all, what a 12 months for him. Quarterback goes down early at American Heritage last year, and Brandon Inniss, number one receiver in the class, is moving to quarterback, trying to figure that out. I mean, just kind of a funky situation for him. But now all things are even. He's back at receiver and had a 200-yard game to kick off his senior season against Lowndes High School in Georgia, which is one of the better high schools in the South. Just some absurd wins at the catch point in game one. And again, he wasn't 20 yards behind the DB catching touchdowns. He was over the DB catching touchdowns and excellent after the catch. So the physicality, the competitiveness that he brings to the position, I think is something that will translate regardless of scheme, regardless of system, and regardless of the other receivers that are going to inevitably be around him and probably hyped more than him. And in that regard, it's kind of fitting. He's going to Ohio State where they've got this absurd wide receiver class that when you start to break it down, everyone else is taller than Brandon Inniss, those other three guys. We talk about Noah Rogers being this huge, big physical catch radius guy. Carnell Tate, this 6'2", smooth-like wide receiver who could win at all three levels. We see all this stuff. And then Bryson Rogers down in Florida, another big target with a great wingspan. You don't get to Inniss until you talk about some of those other guys. Yet I'll make this prediction. If they all go to Ohio State and all play in this great offense that we're going to see on the field here this fall and stay healthy. Yeah, all things even, right? Brandon Inniss will be the most productive of this group because he wins in those margins and he does the little things well. His floor is higher than the ceiling with some of these other recruits that they're bringing in. And I think that's where, again, it's easy to talk about that one trait with another recruit. But again, collectively, Brandon Inniss checks about every box. He just doesn't check it as highly as some of these other receivers that we talk about. So big fan of his. And I think a guy who's just going to make us all look smarter by having that number one next to his name at the wide receiver position.
I think that I'm willing to go with you here. If everything is equal, I don't think there's any doubt that if you take the last two classes of receivers together, nobody catches more passes than he does. Now maybe
that's saying a lot.
Maybe somebody has more yards, kind of like what we saw, like last year. If John Mechie doesn't get hurt, I think he catches more passes than Jamison Williams, but he definitely doesn't have more yards than Jamison Williams. And I think that's the kind of thing I look at. Well, actually, John Mechie had more catches than Jamison Williams last year. Jamison had more yards. I think we will see that. It'll be a situation where he's a volume guy. He'll have more third down catches than any receiver in the class. He'll have more total catches. I mean, he'll have more. He'll just be that money player, and I just don't think anybody else on the roster has that. And that's saying a lot when you consider how well Ohio State's recruited that position the last 2 years.
Yeah,
that's no small shake. So a very, very talented football player, and I think that's what the position has become, right? I mean, if you look at the NFL, it's the Devontae Adams types, it's the Cooper Kupps types, it's the guy that maybe aren't the explosive. I mean, Tyreek Hill's a phenomenal player. He's the highlight reel guy, right? But it's those other guys that are every bit as productive and they're just different. And I think that's kind of what the position is really turning to. is, yeah, you're fast and you're all this kind, but can you play? Do you know how to get open?
It's polished.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
polished business, and those guys, I throw in like a Stephon Diggs in that conversation
Mhm.
too. Those guys can all break you
Yeah.
down at the line of scrimmage, and then if you're still in the game at the top of the route, they can break you down there as well. It's not about running by you; they're
Right.
breaking you down from a technical
Right.
perspective, and that's like you said in this basketball on grass version of football. That's what wins and creates
Right.
these open windows for QBs.
And you're not going to have the big separation in the NFL as you will in college,
Correct.
right? And so they want those guys that can not only be great route runners to create whatever separation you can, but can you win at the catch point? And that's the other part of what makes Devontae Adams great. I mean, the playoff touchdown he had, was it a touchdown or was it a deep ball that he had in the playoffs last year? Where he just scoops off the ground. Cooper Kupp makes crazy catches in traffic, right? That's the other part of it too, John, that I think Brandon Inniss. So the ability to knows how to get open, knows how to position his body in a way where this guy's on me, but if I can just get my body here, he can't get to the ball, and I know he's not knocking out of my hands. There's a lot to be said for that for a kid who didn't even play the position for the most of his junior. His intellectual feel for the game is outstanding, and I think that's talk about he doesn't check all the boxes. That's the one box he flat out checks is this is a kid that just knows how to play the game of football, and there's a lot to be said for that.
100%. Yeah. Safest bet, maybe in the whole class. And I think that says a lot, right? If we talk about checking a box, I think I would bank on Brandon Inniss above just about any other player. There's some high floor quarterbacks,
Certainly
Dante
on
Moore,
offense. Certainly
Arch
on
Manning.
offense.
Yeah, I think high floor and safe bet wise, this is where the conversation begins for me in evaluating this class of 2023. And then I know we talk about Friday nights, and that's obviously the most important data point we could ever gather. But if there was ever a recruit to bring up 7-on-7 with, it's with Brandon Inniss, because he's probably taken the most 7-on-7 reps in the history of the sport, or whatever we want to call it. And you see these traits come out. Oftentimes we were like, it's not real football and all that stuff. And that's true. But when you talk about receivers and DBs and the ball in the air and things like that, it's a whole lot of translation to what we
Sure.
see on Fridays and eventually Saturdays. And in those regards, everyone else will tell you Brandon Inniss is the baddest dude. Carnell Tate on the same team, Malachi Nelson on the same team. They're telling you, Brandon Inniss, that's the guy. That's the guy. So I think that, also creates a lot more benefit of the doubt in trying to rank these guys and all those things.
John, we could do a whole show on the value of 7-on-7 or not amongst as far as evaluating kids. But here's what it tells me about Brandon Inniss. He's already ranked high. He's a highly ranked kid. He's going to Ohio State. He has all his offers. There's nothing to gain by him competing as much as he competes in all these events. What it tells me above everything else beyond, because I don't really care a lot about receivers being aggressive going after the ball when they know they can't get hit.
Right.
It doesn't, but for a fracky kid that has nothing to prove, that is going to look for every opportunity to go compete, that right there is one of the things I love. That's what I take away. This kid has nothing to prove. What's he need to go to 7-on-7s for? If anything, he runs the more risk of hurting his reputation or his brand or his body by coming these days. And I love kids that compete. And that's the kind of guy you look at and say, because what I love about guys like that is when his hammy's tight, when his ankle's sore, when his shoulder's sore, when he's got a dislocated finger, he's still going to answer the bell.
Yep.
He's going to answer the bell. When he's in Columbus and it's 25 degrees, the weekend they're going to play Michigan, and he's not going to be used to that. But when the whistle blows, it's not going to faze him because he's going to compete. And I think there is a lot to be said by that. And that, to me, more than anything, is why his IQ and that competitiveness, more than anything, are why I would agree that you could make a strong case that there's not a higher floor in this class on the offensive class than Brandon Inniss, if not the whole class. And so I think it made some great points there. And again, sounds a lot like John Mechie, except one difference. I think that Brandon is more advanced as a receiver than John was coming out of high school, who was, early on looked like more of a safety prospect with some people than he was a receiver. So I think the sky is certainly the limit for Brandon Inniss.
Yeah, that's a good point. The biggest difference was the development. Mechie coming from Canada and then eventually playing prep school ball in the States, or as opposed to Inniss growing up in South Florida, just spotlight from middle school, where he started to get scholarship offers. So yeah, that's the biggest difference. So when you start talking about coming in ready to go, I think Inniss will hit that ground running, regardless of who's in that wide receiver room at Ohio State, which is a hard sentence to put together given the talent they have there. He's going to find his way on the field and he'll be productive soon thereafter. So yeah, big fans there. And the heck of a way to kick off our state of recruiting comp series. Brandon Inniss, John Mechie, link them together, height, weight, skill set, and floor. And I think that, when we stack up these careers statistically, maybe we'll see something similar in a couple years when Brandon wraps up there in Columbus, Ohio.
Well, I can't wait to see who you have for next week's comp series. And that is what we're going to look forward to next, John. This is going to wrap up today's edition of the State of Recruiting podcast with John Garcia Jr. We'll be back next week, so make sure you are signed up for or subscribed to CFB Nation on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We're going to eventually get this out on even more platforms. Of course, sign up for our page on YouTube, CFB Nation, because you're going to get much, much more. This is just getting started. John Garcia Jr. is going to have a lot of content, different looks, different angles. The high school seasons have started off, so we're going to have some recaps on top players, big recruiting weekends coming up. John talked about the Notre Dame Ohio State game next weekend. Obviously, there's going to be some big-time names on that. You've got the Alabama-Texas game. It's going to be all year, so just so much going on, which is why you don't want to miss an episode. And if you're subscribed to the CFB Nation podcast, you won't, so make it happen.